And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be ever more acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. No less than a radically reordered worldview is needed. This was one of the themes of the colloquium I attended this weekend, co-sponsored by our diocese and the University of Victoria's Center for Studies in Religion and Society. The conference explored the interconnected themes of land, law, religion, and reconciliation. The keynote speaker was the Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne. She's the moderator of the United Church of Canada, which is a position sort of akin to our primate Linda Nichols. It was Dr. Lansdowne's suggestion that no less than a radically reordered worldview is needed. This suggestion was picked up by the Reverend Dr. John Titaminal, our own diocesan theologian, in his response to her keynote address on the land back movement. We heard the theme again in a panel discussion on Saturday morning about the redevelopment of church property. And that panel discussion brought together much of Friday's discussions about property and tax law in theological terms. No less than a radically reordered worldview is needed. It's an idea that kind of wended its way throughout our learning over the weekend. The colloquium began on Thursday evening with a lecture from Professor David Seljak of the University of Waterloo. He offered context for what was to come through a framework of social order and religious development in Canada. He outlined a pattern of there being a problem, so we come up with a solution, and that solution creates a new situation. And the new situation leads to new problems, so we come up with a new solution, which creates new situations. And so on, problem, solution, new situation, and we keep doing that until we meet Jesus. In the history of Canada, he identified 4 broad stages of development, from colonial Christendom through plural establishment of Christian Canada to secular Canada, and on to the newly emerging post-secularism. With each new stage, some things are left behind, others are carried forward. We have seen a stark example of that this weekend with the coronation of Charles III as king. In news coverage, commentators refer to the ages-old ritual and pageantry, adapted somewhat with modern tweaks. Even so, with the event taking place in the state church, presided over by Church of England leaders, the powerful connection of the church with monarchical rule was obvious and profound. Watching it here in Canada, it is a forceful reminder of our colonial past that may not be as past as we sometimes think. This moment offers us a particularly poignant opportunity to reflect on our history and the worldview that has shaped our society and our church, in too many ways remains with us. In the colloquium, we reflected on the colonial worldview that understands land as property. This worldview is underpinned by the legal concepts of terra nullius, which is a concept that justifies territorial conquest by deeming a land unoccupied or uninhabited. And then the second one is the papal decree known as the doctrine of discovery. These 2 foundational principles are why the vast majority of Canada is now called Crown land. The Indigenous people who did actually occupy and inhabit this land before British and other settlers arrived, they had no such concept of land as property. When we arrived, we didn't recognize or respect the laws that governed their relationships with the land and with each other, because they were very different from our own. and because we were guided by a worldview of our own supremacy, white supremacy. Our legal, economic, political, and religious structures continue to be based on this worldview. And it is why nothing less than a radically reordered worldview is needed. In our contemporary context of aging and declining churches that nevertheless own property worth billions across Canada, lawyers and theologians at the colloquium reflected on Abrahamic religious teachings about property, property as privilege, property as problem, property as praise, and property as power. If we were to workshop these ideas here at St. George's, we might record on flip charts ways in which this property, our building, our surrounding green spaces, how this property sitting on stolen land is for us privilege, problem, praise, and power. John Tatamanel suggested that the way forward might require a kind of interreligious dialogue between Christian churches, Indigenous communities, and the most powerful player today of global capitalism. If religion is about how we order our desires, then the market is the most dominant religious force in our world today. Now, developing our knowledge and our understanding of property laws, of tax laws, the financial and governance structures created for the power and privilege of colonial churches and their mostly white adherents, this knowledge and understanding is only the beginning. Knowing alone will not, does not transform us or our world. Only practices of the body, actually actively changing the structures that guide our common life, will get us closer to reconciliation with God, with our Indigenous neighbors, and with the land itself, creation itself. We need to do more than tweak what is and what has been. We need nothing less than a radically reordered worldview to take us beyond our colonial roots and our white Christian privilege, to guide us in how we redevelop our church, its property, our governance, and our finances. Now, this may be a daunting task. Indeed, I certainly have become more and more aware of how daunting a task it is. But Jesus assures us today, do not let your hearts be troubled. It's the beginning of the so-called farewell discourse in the Gospel of John that comes just after the Last Supper, when Jesus washes his disciples' feet, foretells their betrayal and denial, and gives them a new commandment to love. Jesus' farewell speech seeks to comfort and prepare us for his impending departure and the radical upending of our world and our worldview. In our liturgical context today, we're just past the halfway point of the Easter season. And so we're not preparing for Jesus' death on the cross. We're preparing for the risen Christ's ascension. It is a new stage when some things are left behind and others are carried forward. I go, Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you. That I go, as one commentator describes, is the all-encompassing fulfillment of incarnation in the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus, all together. It is a radical reordering of a worldview that developed before the cross, before the resurrection, and yet contains them both. It is a radical reordering that calls us to incarnate God's will and God's ways into our world, the way Jesus did and others before us. A radical reordering of our worldview is needed so that the way, the truth, and the life of God may be known and lived out in, through, and for all people, and indeed all creation.